The first thing Moses ever knew was motion. Not sound, not words, not even fear. Just a slow, uneasy rocking of water beneath him. The feeling of being carried where he had no strength to resist. Long before he learned his name, before memory had shape or meaning, the world had already decided to take him away from everything that should have been familiar. He lay wrapped tightly in rough linen, the fibers pressing against the skin, the air damp and warm. Above him, light flickered through reeds and sky, broken into trembling pieces by the movement of the river. Somewhere beyond the basket, a woman stood frozen at the edge of the Nile, her arms still extended long after she had let go. She did not cry out. That was the cruelest part. She had learned that sound could betray you. Her grief stayed locked behind her teeth, her breath shallow, her body rigid as stone. She watched the basket drift, every inch of distance tearing something loose inside her chest. This was not an act of hope. It was an act of surrender dressed up as courage. The Nile carried the child onward, indifferent to the fear stitched into the moment. Water lapped gently against the woven reeds, as if the river itself were careful not to wake him. Crocodiles lurked farther downstream. Birds called overhead. Life continued, unconcerned with the quiet gamble being made upon its surface. By the time hands reached down into the water and lifted the basket free, the child had already crossed an invisible line. He would never return to the life he was born into. He would never remember the voice that first whispered over him. He would never know how close he had come to being swallowed by history. The woman who found him was young, draped in linen so white it seemed untouched by the sun. Her fingers hesitated when she heard him cry, not from disgust or fear, but recognition. This was not the cry of an Egyptian child. She knew it instinctively, even if she could not explain why. When she lifted him, the world shifted. Servants gathered behind her, murmuring softly. The riverbank became suddenly crowded. Yet the moment itself felt impossibly small, as if everything had narrowed down to the fragile weight of a child against her arms. She studied his face, the curve of his nose, the darkness of his hair, the way his chest shuddered as he struggled for breath between cries. "He will be called Moses," she said at last, as if naming him would anchor him to something solid, as if a name could protect him. Years passed, and Moses grew surrounded by stone and gold. The palace was loud with footsteps and voices, with laughter that echoed too easily and commands that required no explanation. He learned to walk across polished floors without slipping. He learned to eat foods his body was never meant to crave. He learned to listen without speaking and to watch without revealing what he felt. He was taught the language of rulers, the history of conquerors, the etiquette of men who never questioned their right to power. He dressed like them, stood like them, learned to carry himself as though the world were meant to bend. And yet, there was always something that did not fit. It showed itself in reflections, in moments when Moses caught sight of his own face beside theirs, in the way servants sometimes looked at him twice, in the questions no one asked aloud. He belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. When he was old enough to walk beyond the palace walls, the truth met him without ceremony. The air outside the city was heavier, thick with dust and sweat. Men bent beneath loads that pressed their shoulders raw. Women moved slowly, their eyes dull with exhaustion. Children stood too still, watching with an awareness far too old for their years. Moses stopped walking. He had seen labor before. He had seen order enforced. But this was something different. This was suffering stretched thin over years, worn into the body like a second skin. He watched as a man stumbled, his knees buckling under the weight he carried. No one rushed to help. No one dared. Something inside Moses shifted, sharp and sudden. A fracture he hadn't known existed opened wide, and the world rushed in. That night, sleep refused to come. The walls of the palace felt closer than ever, pressing inward. He replayed the day again and again, unable to reconcile what he had been taught with what he had seen. Power no longer looked clean. Authority no longer felt deserved. Soon after, Moses fled. There was no ceremony in his leaving, no final look back, just dust beneath his sandals and the burning sun overhead. Each step away from Egypt stripped something from him. First comfort, then certainty, then identity itself. The wilderness did not welcome him. It tested him. Days blurred together beneath the endless sky. Hunger became familiar. Silence grew loud. He learned the patience of animals, the language of wind against stone, the way loneliness settles into the bones. Years passed before he realized he had stopped waiting for something to happen. Shepherding was not heroic. It was repetitive, slow, often thankless. Sheep wandered. Sheep panicked. Sheep required constant attention and gave little in return. Moses aged quietly among them, his hands roughening, his back bending, his dreams shrinking until they fit neatly into the shape of survival. Then, one ordinary day, something refused to behave as it should. He saw it from a distance at first, a bush of light against a dull palette of rock and sand. Fire was not unusual in the wilderness. What made him stop was not the flame, but its stillness. The bush burned, yet it did not collapse. Leaves did not curl. Branches did not blacken. Moses stepped closer. The air felt different there, heavy and alert, as though the ground itself were paying attention. The fire flickered without sound, bright but contained, as if it obeyed rules Moses had never learned. He removed his sandals without fully knowing why. When the voice came, it did not thunder. It did not need to. It spoke his name as if it had always known it, as if it had been waiting for him to stop running. Moses trembled. The words that followed were not gentle. They were not flattering. They were not what he wanted to hear. He was being sent back, to the place he had escaped, to the power he had abandoned, to a people whose suffering he could no longer ignore. He argued. He protested. He listed his failures, his fears, his inadequacies like evidence in a trial he was determined to lose. The fire did not recede. The calling did not soften. When the voice fell silent, Moses remained there long after the flames dimmed. He knew what waited for him. Resistance, doubt, danger. He knew the cost would not be small, and that obedience would not feel heroic. It would feel heavy, lonely, terrifying. Still, when he finally turned away from the mountain, his steps were steady. The man who walked back toward Egypt was not the boy who had floated helplessly on the Nile, nor the prince who had fled in fear, nor the shepherd who had learned to disappear into routine. He was something else now, and though the road ahead would test him beyond anything he imagined, through plagues and confrontations, through the sea itself, this was only the beginning, because once a life has been interrupted like this, there is no returning to what it was before, and Egypt had no idea what was coming. Moses did not walk back into Egypt as a conqueror. He returned as a man carrying a sentence he could not escape. The city had not changed. The same stone walls rose against the sky. The same banners caught the wind. The same river moved through the land as if nothing had ever been demanded of it. Egypt was confident, unmoved by absence, unimpressed by return. But Moses had changed. Every step through the outer courts felt heavier than the last. His staff tapped against the stone with a steady rhythm that betrayed none of the unease in his chest. Faces turned. Some recognized him. Others only saw a stranger dressed too plainly to belong. By the time he stood before the throne, silence had spread through the hall. Pharaoh leaned forward slightly, curiosity flickering across his face before settling back into practiced indifference. He remembered Moses. Of course he did. The boy raised among privilege. The man who disappeared without explanation. A curiosity from another life. "You have returned," Pharaoh said, his voice smooth, unhurried. "Have you come to reclaim what you abandoned?" Moses did not bow. He did not soften his words or dress them in flattery. He spoke plainly, and the sound of it cut through the chamber, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Let the people go." The court stilled. Pharaoh laughed, not loudly, but with enough confidence to remind everyone who held power in this room. "You returned from the desert," he said, wearing dust and conviction, "and you speak as though you command me." Moses met his gaze. "I speak because I was sent." That was the moment Pharaoh's amusement hardened. The refusal came swiftly, decisively. Egypt would not be threatened by a former prince turned shepherd. Orders were given before Moses even left the hall. The work of the Hebrews would not lessen. It would increase. If Moses had come hoping to ease suffering, he had done the opposite. The cries reached him before the messengers did. Anger followed close behind. The elders of the people confronted him with eyes sharpened by disappointment. Their hope, fragile and dangerous, had risen too quickly. "You made things worse," they said. "You stirred something you cannot control." Moses had no defense. He stood beneath their words and let them fall. That night, sleep did not come. Doubt pressed in from all sides, whispering that he had misunderstood everything, that his courage had arrived too late, that Egypt would never bend. But the days did not slow. Each return of Pharaoh was met with greater resistance. Each sign only deepened his resolve. The river that once carried Moses away from death turned dark. The land groaned beneath an unraveling order. Still, Pharaoh's heart remained firm, his grip tightening even as his world began to crack. Moses watched the consequences unfold with a growing weight in his chest. This was no longer theory or command. This was suffering, visible and real, and he stood at the center of it. There were moments he wanted to stop, moments he questioned whether obedience was worth the cost, moments when he remembered the quiet of the wilderness and wondered if disappearing had been the wiser choice. But Egypt did not relent, and neither did the calling that had brought him back. The night that changed everything arrived without warning. It began quietly, as the most terrible moments often do. A tension hung over the city, thick and expectant. Doors were shut. Lamps burned low. Families gathered close, uncertain what they waited for, but aware that something irreversible approached. Moses moved through the streets with a heaviness he could not shake. He spoke carefully, urgently, instructing the people to prepare, to trust, to remain inside. His voice did not waver, but his heart did. When morning came, Egypt woke to a silence unlike any before. The palace was shaken. The certainty that defined Pharaoh's rule finally fractured, and from its ruins came a command that Moses had waited for but never imagined would arrive like this. "Go," Pharaoh said, his voice stripped bare. "Leave this land. Take them and go." The exodus began at once. Thousands moved through the city gates under the cover dawn, carrying what little they had, carrying children too young to understand what they were leaving behind. Egypt watched them go, stunned and hollowed. Moses did not look back. They traveled quickly at first, urgency driving them forward. But freedom, Moses learned, is not the same as safety. The wilderness opened wide before them, vast and indifferent. The land did not promise comfort. It only offered space. And then came the sound. Hooves, wheels, the unmistakable echo of pursuit. Panic spread like fire. The people turned on Moses, fear erasing memory. "Were there no graves in Egypt?" they cried. "Why did you bring us here to die?" Moses stood at the edge of the sea as the truth of their position closed in. Water stretched endlessly before them. The army advanced behind them. There was nowhere left to go. For a moment, even Moses felt the pull of despair. Then he lifted his staff. The wind rose, sharp and relentless, tearing across the surface of the water. The sea responded, not gently, but with power, drawing back upon itself, standing apart as if commanded by something deeper than nature alone. The people stared, frozen between terror and awe. "Move," Moses said, and this time his voice carried no doubt. They stepped onto dry ground where water should have swallowed them whole. Walls of sea loomed on either side, trembling yet held in place. The night stretched long as they crossed, each step a defiance of reason, each breath borrowed. When the last of them reached the far shore, Moses turned. Behind them, Egypt surged forward, confidence restored too late. The sea did not hesitate. By dawn, the shoreline was quiet. The people stood in stunned silence, staring at the water that now lay calm and ordinary, as if it had not just rewritten the laws of the world. They were free, but freedom was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a harder journey. As the sun rose over the wilderness, Moses looked out over the people he now led, afraid, untrained, unprepared. Ahead lay hunger, rebellion, and a mountain that would shake the earth itself. The sea had parted behind them. The desert waited ahead, and Moses knew, with a certainty that left no room for comfort, that the greatest trials were still to come.